Thank you very much for being with us. We start with the latest on Ukraine. On the ground, there have been large-scale Russian airstrikes once again. The region of Sumy, with its border with Russia to the north, has been extensively hit. A hospital was all but destroyed. Patients evacuated. A search continues there for the sick trapped under the wreckage. There's also been a prisoner exchange confirmed by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. 175 prisoners going each way. Russia sending back to Ukraine an additional 22 men who are in need of intensive medical care. And there's been a phone call between Volodymyr Zelensky and the US President Donald Trump. This is the first time that they've spoken since their public bust-up in the White House on February the 28th. Much to discuss, of course. What does it all mean? Well, let's bring in our guest to discuss the situation, Melinda Haring, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Melinda, great to have you with us here on France 24. As always, your analysis is appreciated. So Trump saying it was a good telephone call, very much on tracks what he said. What do we read into that?
So we're still waiting for the U.S. to give more detail on the phone call between Zelensky and Trump today. But from the meeting yesterday between the Russians and the Americans, we know that Putin rejected the ceasefire. There was a 30-day ceasefire on offer. As you just stated, overnight, the Russians hit hospitals in northern Ukraine. And there's also reports of them hitting in Dnipro just now. The BBC can't report it, but it looks like it happened within the last hour or so. So the Russians are not respecting any kind of ceasefire agreement, which throws this whole extraordinary exchange into question. Like, what was agreed on, and will Putin adhere to his word? And I think we know the answer to that. Indeed, if we look back to Minsk I, Minsk II, and the fact that what happened then happened, Melinda, you're quite right. I mean, Vladimir Putin does have a track record of not respecting the agreements. That hit on Dnipro, you were talking about, a railway infrastructure was hit there. And clearly this call on Putin to not target infrastructure in Ukraine is clearly, well, it seems like a very futile call, doesn't it? It does. And I think it's important to say, Mark, that Vladimir Putin has a history also of hitting hospitals. Your viewers will remember last summer, the Russians hit a children's cancer hospital in Kiev, and they've hit numerous hospitals across the country. So these are obviously civilian sites. But yesterday, in the so-called ceasefire agreement, Putin said that he wouldn't hit infrastructure, and we see him already not adhering to that pledge. And this will be the 26th, I believe, broken ceasefire agreement that Russia has engaged in since 2014. So there's a long history of Putin breaking his word. Melinda, what can Trump mean then when he says we're very much on track? Because clearly, from what we're seeing and from what you're telling us, we don't appear to be. No, we don't appear to be. And it's hard to know where we go next, because it looks like Washington and Moscow are trying to cut a deal without Ukraine or without the Europeans. And we see the Europeans are acting in solidarity, and they're basically preparing for war, Mark. They are now increasing their budgets and preparing for readiness. So I think the Europeans have basically decided that Washington is unreliable, and they're not going to bet their security on us anymore. Are you alarmed? And many people are, and I'm sure you will be, but I'll put the question to you, and obviously you tell me what you think. Are you alarmed that Donald Trump's talking about perhaps doing deals and business with Vladimir Putin, even at this stage? Yes. So I think this is the sweetener. I think that Trump's offering, I believe that Putin is offering Trump some kind of rare earth deal, some kind of sweetened business deals in exchange for what the Russians want. And the Russian demands, I think it's important to say, are not different than they were 3 years ago. So Putin is showing no signs of compromise. He's saying he wants Ukraine to be completely neutral. So NATO is off the table. No foreign troops in Ukraine. And he wants the United States to stop giving foreign weapons to Ukraine as well. So if that happens, and clearly you've mentioned that Europe is now stepping up its armaments, is looking to get onto what appears to be a war footing. And Emmanuel Macron has been one of the loudest voices in talking about that.
Do you think, from the US side of things under the Trump administration as it stands right now, do they think that Vladimir Putin is actually going to stop where he is? Or are they just closing their eyes to the fact, and this has been seen already, that there is Russian influence and Russian pushing to get into other places, such as Georgia, such as Moldova, those kind of places like that, and of course the rest of Ukraine? Is there a real sense in the Trump administration that Putin will stay where he is, or are they being kind of disingenuous about it?
I think the answer is a bit different, Mark, and it's kind of puzzling because the answer to your question should be, of course, the Russian appetite is not going to be sated in Ukraine, and it's going to continue, right? I think that that's a pretty normal expectation. But the Trump administration sees things differently. They're not. They don't see Russia as the greatest threat to U.S. national interests. They see China as the greatest threat to U.S. national interests. We have two oceans that protect the United States. So it's a completely different way of thinking about U.S. national interests. It's basically Europe's problem, and Europe should start paying, and Europe should grow up and solve its own problems. That's the attitude in Washington since Donald Trump took over.
Melinda, let's go onto the ground in Ukraine and talk a bit about what Ukraine needs, because the, excuse me, Volodymyr Zelensky from the very start has made it clear that he needs weapons. Like you said, he didn't need a ride out of Ukraine, he needed weapons to fight. He needed the skies to be closed. And that has been consistent all along. And to an extent, the Biden administration did provide the wherewithal to do that. Now, Europe has to try to fill that gap. And already the feeling is that that can't be done. Is that your interpretation of the situation too?
It's a little slightly different. So the United States provides 20% of the kit that Ukraine needs. And 20% doesn't sound like a huge number, Mark, but it's the most lethal of the kit. So the United States provides the Patriot systems, and Ukraine has other air defense, but Patriots are the only air defense system that can take down Russian ballistic missiles. And these are the very fast ones that are causing enormous civilian damage. So I'm worried about Patriots. We also are the ones who provide the HIMARS, the long-range rockets. They're not the greatest thing on earth. They were more important earlier in the conflict, but they're still important, and there's no analogous Ukrainian system. And finally, our surveillance is the best, and the Europeans can provide alternatives, but it's not as good as ours. So that's why it's very important that the United States continues its assistance, particularly with air defense.
In terms of the willingness to fight, I mean, clearly, the Trump administration pointed out there's been no election in Ukraine, and clearly that was a ridiculous thing to talk about and accuse Volodymyr Zelensky of being a dictator. Complete nonsense. But the fact of the matter is that Ukrainians very much support not the war, but the need to fight. They really want to sort of defend their territory, keep going along those lines. Now, sadly, that in itself isn't enough. The backing has to come in some way, shape or form. Is there any way you think that the Trump administration can, in some way, be made to change its tack? Would that depend on how Vladimir Putin reacts to the next developments?
So I think that Trump's insistence that Ukraine hold elections is nonsense, and it's actually a Russian talking point, and it should be rejected out of hand. Ukraine is a vibrant democracy that holds regular elections every 5 years, and they're democratic. Look at any of the international scales. But the elections were suspended because of martial law. It's what would happen in any country under war. Mark, I spent quite a bit of time talking to international election experts, and they say there's no way to hold free and fair elections because of the way that Ukraine is divided up right now. So Russia holds 20% of Ukraine. It illegally occupies 20% of the country. So that's a hard piece to know what to do with in terms of elections. There are also 6 million Ukrainians living abroad, and it's impossible to have an election and be able to have all these people participate in a free and fair way. So I think the claim that Ukraine is not a democracy and Volodymyr Zelensky is illegitimate is just pure nonsense. And actually, if you look at Zelensky's polling numbers, his approval rating is sky high. And there's no demand. This is the most important thing. There's no demand for elections among the Ukrainian people. They understand, and they want. They don't want elections right now. They want him to continue. Mark, I just got back from Kharkiv, which is in the north of Ukraine. And I spent a couple of hours with brigade commanders. And you ask them, how long can you keep going? Don't you have a shortage of men? And they'll acknowledge we have a shortage. of men, but we have the will to fight, and this is existential, and we're going to continue to fight as long as we have to, because these are our homes and our children and our communities. There's no alternative.
There will be, we're led to believe, some sense that Ukraine will have to concede ground, concede land. Zelensky, of course, and Ukraine has said consistently from the start of this back in 2022, and indeed back in 2014, when Crimea was annexed, that they want their territory back, their borders to be re-established as to where they were. There's got to be, we're led to believe, some extent that something's going to be given away. And one wonders how that will play out in the future if that happens. If, say, the Donbass is given to Russia, where does that go? How does that proceed? Clearly, Ukraine isn't going to really want that to happen or even recognize it, but might have to live with it. It surely would create, going forward, some kind of awkward peace.
Absolutely. So this 20% of Ukraine is going to be one of the very sticky points. And you put it rightly. Zelensky has said, we will not compromise on land. We will not give our land away. Too much has been lost. So you have the Crimea piece, and this is the peninsula that the Russian President Vladimir Putin illegally annexed back in 2014. And the status of that is still undetermined. Russia says it's theirs. They held a fake referendum. But the rest of the international community says, heck no, that is not Russian. It's disputed. So you have to deal with the status of Crimea. And you also needed to deal with these 4 different provinces in eastern Ukraine. Russia tried to illegally annex them in 2022. No one recognizes that territory as Russian. So this is going to come down to the negotiating table. And I think in order to persuade the Ukrainians to give up some of that territory, and I'm not sure that they're going to agree to that, you would have to give them real security guarantees. And we know that NATO is off the table. So the real security guarantee that Ukraine is going to be looking for are foreign boots on the ground. And Trump has said no way to that. So, Mark, I think we're in a really sticky position, and the path forward is really not clear.
Melinda Haring, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, among others. Thank you very much indeed for your analysis of the situation, which at the moment isn't clear, but obviously we're waiting for results of that phone call between Trump and Zelensky to emerge. But your analysis, as ever, spot on, and a great clarification for all our viewers. Thank you, Melinda, once again for being with us.
Pleasure.
Melinda Haring, thank you very much indeed. We'll bring you more on this situation, of course, as we get it, and we're waiting for greater clarification of the Trump-Zelensky phone call, described by Trump as a good call.